Thank you for joining us today on our information session to cooperative housing. Today, we are here at Cooperatives First on the Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. So, welcome everybody. We're really happy you are here. It's amazing to see so many people interested in housing and are able to join us today. Uh, for those who are new or unfamiliar with Cooperatives First was established in 2016, and we're created out of a study from the Center of Cooperative Studies that really wanted to see if the cooperative model is still relevant and kind of what were the barriers and why there hasn't been a growth in the co-op sector. And it was found that both rural and Indigenous communities throughout Western Canada still have the desire to work together, but those supports were lacking. So by support of our generous funder, Federated Cooperatives Limited, we were created to be that support, to create awareness of cooperatives throughout Western Canada and to support cooperative development. So today we are having the cooperative housing information session. This topic has it been a hot topic with housing in short supply and people reaching out to us to see what it takes to start a co-op, what is a housing co-op, and how the structure works. My name is Trista and I'm the Director of Indigenous Relations. I have here with me today, Kyle White is our Director of Education, and taking care of all of our technical aspects of this is our newest employee, Riley Hawkswood, and he is the Community Engagement Coordinator. So I really want to thank you for being here with us today. And since we have quite a bit to discuss, I will just jump right into it. So many of these questions came through us through our social media or direct emails or phone calls that have come into our office. So we have selected many of these questions and we will be answering them. And we also did bring in expert panelists to answer some of these questions a little later on. But we will give time at the end of this presentation to ask any questions. So please type them into the Q&A section as they come up. And at the end of the webinar, we will go through the questions from the participants here today. So the first question that I am going to pose to Kyle is, what is a housing co-op and what are the different types of housing co-ops?
Awesome. Thanks, Trista. And good morning, everybody. Good to be with you guys today. Housing co-ops, as their name kind of suggests, are a cooperative whose primary purpose is to provide housing. In our work supporting the creation of new co-ops, we've kind of seen a bit of an expanded approach to providing housing using the cooperative model. And when it comes to the four different types of housing co-ops I'll touch on, it's helpful maybe to think of those in two different sections. The first are what I'll call maybe traditional housing co-ops, which are tenant-owned organizations where the members of the cooperative are the people who reside in the housing complex. The other are maybe non-conventional housing cooperatives. And those are cooperatives where the members are usually the community, whether they're investors or volunteers. It's a more community-owned approach. So I'll go through each of those four types of housing co-ops. The first, and by far the most common type of housing co-op that we have in Canada, are what's called a non-profit housing cooperative. Um, if you've got a housing co-op in your community, it's most likely it's this kind of model. Um, Nonprofit housing cooperatives offer what's called a non-market approach to housing. The individuals who reside in those housing co-ops, the tenants, are also the members, the owners of the cooperative. They usually become a member by purchasing membership shares, which often is a similar price to a down payment or a damage deposit. Most co-ops that I'm aware of charge somewhere between $800 to $2,000 as their upfront membership cost. And what really sets these co-ops apart from other ways of renting is they are at cost. So the cost of rent that an individual pays, which most co-ops will call housing charges, are usually quite reflective of the actual costs of operating that housing co-op, and it's shared amongst those who live there. Um, what really sets these apart from maybe corporate owned rentals is there's no incentive for rents to perpetually increase. Because they're a non market housing solution, the purpose is to provide shelter and housing for the people who live there. It's not to reward investors or landlords. Um, so, usually, when we look at the data, the rents or the housing charges that members of housing co ops pay, it's usually somewhere on the order of 10 to 40% less than average rental rates city to city. And there's really phenomenal data and reports provided by the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. If you check them out, CHF, they're a fantastic resource for some of this data. Um, and some examples of this I encourage you to check out. We've just worked with a new housing co-op called Serenity Housing Co-op that's going to operate in BC. Here in Saskatoon, we'll hear later from James Gillard, who's with Rainbow Housing. But if we look at Quebec as just an example, there's over 1,000 housing co-ops like this in the province of Quebec. And collectively, these make up about 2,000 co-ops all across Canada. So they're fairly active in the Canadian housing space, but we arguably need more. The second type of housing co-op is what's called a for-profit or an equity or market housing co-op. These are a little less common in Canada, but they're an alternative to condominiums or stratas. And they allow the members of the co-op to build equity in their units. It's a way for homeowners to come together in a more collective or collaborative sense. Some co-housing units may use an equity housing co-op model instead of a condominium or a strata. And again, this is a great alternative for homeowners who want to invest in their home as an asset. There's not a lot of these in Canada. It's far more of a common model in the US, specifically in New York City. Fun bit of pop trivia for folks. If you're familiar with the show How I Met Your Mother, the fellow Barney in that show is actually on the board of his housing co-op. Fun little bit of trivia. One cool example of this is there's a great co-housing space in Calgary. A colleague of ours, Hazel Corcoran, was a part of that co-op. It's a really good example of co-housing using a cooperative model. A third way of approaching housing using co-ops, and this would be where we would shift away from tenant owned to community owned, would be using a community service co-op. It's fairly common here in the prairies, for organizations like seniors facilities to be cooperatively owned. A community service co-op reflects many of the same characteristics of a nonprofit corporation or a nonprofit society. And the purpose of those co-ops is to provide housing, care, um, affordability, aging in place infrastructure for usually seniors. There's some great examples in Mossbank, Saskatchewan, and we're working with a group in the RM of Piney in southeastern Manitoba that's providing ideally affordable housing and care for seniors that want to age in place. Um, the owners of those co-ops, the members of those co-ops, are usually drawn from the broader community. So people who want to dedicate some time and effort to building infrastructure that their community needs. The folks we've been working with in Piney, there's some representatives from local governments. There's folks who are part of a housing organization that have been fundraising for years and years to support the development of new housing. And then there's just, the good volunteers in communities that do that sort of work. That's not a particularly common model in Canada. I'm aware of about 2 or 3 dozen, but because seniors housing is a growing need for communities, it's probably the request that we get most frequently when it comes to housing is how do we address the shortage of seniors care in our communities? And finally, the last approach that we've seen in terms of housing and is fairly new, I would say, in the co-ops that we're seeing, is a community investment co-op that invests into housing. And I'm actually only aware of 1 or 2 examples where this has been considered, and we'll hear, I think, from one of those examples later in the webinar, is from the Sangudo Opportunity Development Co-op. And that model, the community investment model, allows individuals in a community to invest in a local fund that's managed by the cooperative. And that fund can be put to work in their community. It could give loans to local businesses, it could partner with entrepreneurs to expand services, or in the case of Sangudo, they identified housing as a need in their community, so the co-op invested in the development of new homes. Um, really interesting initiative. And if you've got folks around your decision-making table who have the funds, have the means to invest in housing stock to address maybe an issue with available housing, this is a really great model. And the cooperative could realize returns on its investment through the sale of those units, or should it want to, it could become a landlord and rent out that housing. So that's a fairly uncommon, unconventional approach to housing development using a cooperative. But again, depending on who you've got around the table that want to invest both time and money in the creation of new housing, be it affordable or what have you, form should really follow function. So if you've got investors around the table, maybe a community investment co-op is the right move. If you've got some good volunteers around and you want to invest in affordable housing, maybe community service co-ops the move. But if you've got folks who want to access affordable housing, they want to be the ones who live there, then a traditional housing co-op is probably what you're after. So those would be the 4 types of housing co-ops that exist in Canada and that we've worked on here at Cooperatives First.
Thank you, Kyle. So I'm going to, this question is actually kind of a multi-part question. So is the legislation different among provinces for starting a co-op? Is it similar? And is there federal policy or legislation to be aware of?
Great question. This is an area where I kind of work with our clients at Cooperatives First all the time, is helping them navigate the legislation, the regulations to bring their co-op about. Um, at least in the 4 Western provinces, and I should clarify maybe off the top, every province maintains its own legislation that regulates cooperatives, as does the federal government through the Canada Cooperatives Act, primarily for co-ops that intend on operating in multiple provinces. Um, and in every piece of legislation I've seen, housing cooperatives are a specifically regulated type of cooperative. So they have additional regulations placed upon them above and beyond the ordinary legislative rules that apply to all cooperatives. And the reason for that is because they have a very specific purpose, and in some cases, they need to fall into line with some of the provisions we would see in rental legislation. So cooperative acts will usually speak to that type of relationship a little bit, the landlord and tenant relationship. Not all types that I've just mentioned are allowed in all provinces. For example, here in Saskatchewan, housing cooperatives have to be organized on a not-for-profit basis. So the for-profit or equity housing co-ops that I mentioned aren't actually permitted in Saskatchewan under existing legislation. Our act is being updated in 2024, so maybe that will change. But currently, if you want to have an organization that's owned by homeowners, a condominium or strata is the model that's allowed in Saskatchewan. Outside of the Western provinces, I'm not sure if there's restrictions on how housing co-ops can be organized, but in Manitoba, Alberta, and BC, we do have examples of equity housing co-ops. And the other thing I'd note is with community investment co-ops, usually the business model for those co-ops will often rely on securities exemptions being available to co-ops, largely so that the upfront costs of being able to issue securities tools, such as investment shares to members or investors, isn't exceptionally expensive. Some provinces aren't as favorable in that respect. Alberta and BC, I would argue, have the best securities exemptions in place for cooperatives, whereas Saskatchewan is a little bit behind, Manitoba a little bit behind. And there is federal legislation as well governing nonprofit housing co-ops. I'm not aware of any co-ops, housing co-ops that are federally regulated. I would presume that they would operate in multiple provinces if they were, but I'm not aware of any of those. So if any of our panelists later are aware of a federal housing co-op, I'd love to hear about it. I'd like to speak with them and see how that works. But yeah, usually if you're creating some sort of housing organization, you'll fall under one of the provincial acts. And depending on the regulations, most of these options will be available to you. In Saskatchewan, there's the exception. It's a little bit more restrictive. So it is very different province to province. And I should also add the caveat there too. Different provinces will also offer different supports to housing organizations. In our work with groups creating housing co-ops, we found that the province of BC currently does have a number of supports available to specifically nonprofit and affordable housing co-ops.
Oh, thank you, Kyle.
Yeah.
So at this point, we are going to um, have some questions from some of our um, from our invited guests from different housing co-ops. We have James Gillard from the Rainbow Housing Co-op and Dan Oler from the Sangudo Opportunities Development Co-op. So I have a few questions, and I will start with James. Can you tell us about your housing co-op and how it works?
be unmuted. There, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Good to go.
can.
Okay, there. Okay, we are a not-for-profit housing co-op. We are also a mixed income community where we have people on social services, and we used to have subsidy, which we no longer have. That ran out in 2021. So now we're most of our members that live at Rainbow Housing Co-op are single parents, seniors, families, and empty nesters. We're 87 units. We do have some apartments, some accessible units. The majority of our units are townhouses, and we're not really member owned, but we are run by the members. We have an elected board of directors that come from our membership. I used to be on the board of directors here at Rainbow for about 12 years. I am currently the treasurer for the board of directors, advisor, and I'm a mentor for some of the new board members. Our community is we have an open door policy. Anybody can apply for membership, and the board of directors approves the membership. And we are also members of the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada and members of the Cooperative Housing Association of Saskatchewan. Let's see what else. 87 units. We are the second largest cooperative in Saskatchewan, the largest being Cornwall Village in Regina. We are the largest family co-op in Saskatchewan. We do have a maintenance staff person. We have an office staff person. Well, actually, we have two maintenance staff because our property is so large that it takes two people to look after it. And so Kyle was talking about the Co-operatives Act a little bit earlier. That's one of our things that we have to follow. We also have to follow the some parts of the Rentalsman Act, but not too much of it applies to housing co-ops. And we, because we have employees, we also have to look after their labor law, make sure that they're, that we're doing our job properly at Rainbow and treating our staff properly. We every year when we do our budget, we allot so much money into replacement reserve or capital replacement, and that is a must as per the Co-operative Act. And every year we do try and keep our housing charges when we have an increase to the minimum, but unfortunately, with the cost of everything going up since the couple of years that we've had with COVID, we've unfortunately had to increase our housing charge a little bit more than usual for 2024. But if we do make any profit, it goes back into the co-op, and the board of directors usually puts it into replacement reserve because those funds can always be bolstered more than what we have. And I think that's about it.
Thank you, James.
You're welcome.
I have a follow-up question. What would you like people to know about starting a nonprofit housing co-op?
Okay, actually, I was just looking at that the other day. CHF Canada has just put out a guide on how to start a housing co-op. 9 things that you should do. First, organize your group. So start off with your own board of directors and go from there. Clarify your vision. Make sure you know what your end game is going to be. Okay. Review co-op housing legislation, and that's where Kyle would come in handy with that aspect. Select a model, and there again, Kyle would be the person to go to. Find support. Yeah, make whether it be with provincial government, federal government, municipal government, you need that support, and the bank as well. Work with consultants and advisors. Don't try and do this all yourself because you're going to end up hitting a brick wall. Incorporate your cooperative. That's one of the first things you have to do. And then join sector organizations like in Saskatchewan, there would be CHAZ, but there's also Federated Co-op might be able to help. Your credit unions might be able to help. The cooperatives might be able to help. And then nationally would be the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, and provincially would be the Cooperative Housing Association of Saskatchewan. And then you start, you can either build, acquire, or convert housing. And that's how you would go about to build, start a nonprofit housing. I got all that information from CHF Canada, so the information is available to help.
Thank you so much, James.
You're welcome.
Okay, next I will be asking Dan Oler from the Sangudo Opportunities Development Co-op a couple questions. Can you tell us what the Sangudo Opportunities Co-op is?
Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. And I'll share a little bit about Sangudo Opportunity Development Co-op, which really isn't a housing co-op, although we have done some housing. But the overarching message, I believe, is that's important is to know that in every community, large or small, you have the resources to make one of these things work. You've got the time, the talent, the treasure, the money to make these work. It's just about pulling together, as James just said, some leaders to put one of these things together. So Sangudo Opportunity Development Co-op started in 2010. Although housing we saw that as important, at that point, what we saw was a lot of our retail businesses that had been for years closing down, people moving away. And we realized we had to do something to help our local economy. And not only the economy, but that kind of works in tandem with the housing. You've got to have some local businesses to support the people, and you have to have housing that can support the businesses. So when we first started in 2010, we actually bought an abattoir right in the hamlet of Sangudo. Sangudo's at that point was only about 300 people. I think we probably had major growth. We might be 305 now. Anyway, we bought the meat shop. We had a couple of young entrepreneurs that were keen to own and operate that, but they couldn't get conventional financing. So we pulled local people together who invested in the co-op. Invested in the co-op to buy the meat shop. We worked a really great lease agreement with the entrepreneurs to make it so that they could succeed. With our next project, we bought the local Legion building that was closing down, and we supported a couple entrepreneurs to renovate that and to start a restaurant and a coffee shop, a meeting place in our community, very much needed. We then supported the meat shop by lending them some more money to do some major renovations. Now, all of this created jobs, which meant we needed some housing as well. We realized, we didn't do any studies, but we realized we had a really good supply of really poor housing in our community. So we purchased 3 residential lots in the hamlet. Our intent was to build housing on one, sell it, build housing on the next, and sell it, build housing on the next, and sell it. We started with the first one. We built a 1,360 square foot home on it. We used a really unique model, which I think could work really well for a housing co-op, where we used our own members' talents. We had carpenters, plumbers, electricians, people that had excavating equipment, and local farmers who can do everything. And we used all of our members' talent to build the house. So we only had to raise what we needed just for the materials for that. It worked really well, and the idea was that all of those members who had provided their talent and their time would invoice at a pre-agreed price that was fair for everybody, so that when the home sold, those people would be paid back first before any profits would be distributed out to members. Worked really well, except that when we finished the house, the real estate market had really faltered here in Alberta, and we weren't able to sell the home. We kept it on the market for a year or so, and then finally decided to rent it out, which we did for a couple of years, and then have just sold that home just back in December a year ago. The other 2 lots, unfortunately, we didn't have the leadership to develop on those at that point, so we sold those. But right now, we are in a huge demand to have some more housing. And we believe that this co-op model that we have can be a great support to fund the construction or renovations of buildings that we have in our community. And we're actually working towards that and looking for some support from Cooperatives First to help with that as well.
Thank you, Dan. So you did cover a bit about how you identified housing projects to invest in. So what were the best learnings that you've taken and how you're going to kind of shift your focus now?
Yeah, I think James kind of addressed these in his 9 points. One is the most critical thing is to have a small group of leaders who see the need and are willing to invest some time and effort to get something going, to get it started. And another piece where we have not done very well, but I think was that point about getting some advisors and some consultants, some people who know how to do this, who can help with some of those feasibility studies. And our model works really well to pull in the capital. However, there has to be that ability to see that it's a feasible long-term project. And I think that's another key piece is for the local people, the local investors to see that this is not just a one and done. This is a longer-term process and a longer-term investment that's going to support the community to thrive and grow.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Can I address one more thing too for just a moment?
Yes, you can.
One of the beautiful things that I missed is that with this investment co-op model that we have through an organization called the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation, people can utilize their RRSPs and their tax-free savings accounts to invest in a project like this. So we know that many people have money put away in RRSPs and tax-free savings accounts. That money can come directly back into your community through an organization like SODC to help with the funding to provide this housing. So it's not people have to write a check. They can already just transfer money that they might have set aside already.
Wow, that's great to hear, and that's a great option. And it's also a segue into our next guest is housing co-ops take capital and take money. So we have Christina Johnson from CMHC here to answer a few of our questions. So welcome, Christina.
Hi.
So first off, what programs are available to housing co-ops from CMHC?
So CMHC has a whole suite of programs, whether it's direct lending or funding directly from CMHC through our national housing strategy or through our commercial products. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of them that would be more applicable for co-ops, and then touch on one that could be, and talk a little bit about our commercial products as well. So the first one we have is seed funding. And this is really funding that's supporting the cost of those pre-development activities. So your need and demand studies, your financial feasibility, incorporation, business plans, preliminary designs, energy modeling, accessibility modeling. So it does cover a lot of things. It's in the form of interest-free loans and non-repayable contributions. So this would help you get some of those pieces of work done to move forward with your co-op. The criteria of that is you need to have a minimum of 5 units that are affordable. The co-op needs to be primarily residential. And that's kind of the minimum eligibility requirements. The one caveat for this program is that our funding's been fully allocated for 2023, so we're no longer accepting applications. But we do anticipate the applications will reopen sometime in 2024. There may be some tweaks to the program, we don't know, but it's something to keep on your radar. And I can absolutely let Kyle and Trista know when that reopens so that you can look at accessing that. In terms of actual capital funding for the co-op, we do have our National Housing Co-investment Fund, which is essentially direct lending from CMHC. So it's low cost repayable loans and some capital contributions that are forgivable. The interest rate is based on CMHC's borrowing rate, which is associated with treasury products. So it's not necessarily associated with our prime lending rate, but it is lower than what you would see going through a traditional lender. We offer that interest rate through 2 10-year terms, and you can go up to 50-year amortization. So that's lowering your payments if you were in a position of having to borrow some funding. And we will provide funding for up to 95% of the capital costs of the project. This is traditionally meant for those nonprofit co-ops. We don't look at the equity, or the equity co-ops aren't eligible under that. So if you are developing a nonprofit, this would be a way to go. We do have some requirements around affordability, energy efficiency, and accessibility. 30% of the units need to meet our affordability criteria, which is less than 80% of the median market rent for that area. So the neighborhood you're building in. And those are based on our rental market report. So we have all that data as well. Energy efficiency, you need to be greater than 25% reduction in energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions relative to the applicable building code. And accessibility, at least 20% of the units need to exceed our accessibility requirements or be full universal design. So we do have those specs in regards to energy efficiency and accessibility. When you're building new, it's easier to meet those targets because you can incorporate those into your drawings. And it's kind of done on a point rating system when we evaluate your application. So meeting those is great, but if you're exceeding, you would automatically get a performance contribution, which means a forgivable loan. So if you're able to exceed some of those targets, it gives you some extra capital that you don't have to repay back. We do have some requirements in regards to social outcomes, like who your tenants are, your location in proximity to things like transit and services in the communities, as well as partnerships. So we are looking at you talking to your municipality, talking to your province, and see if there's any funding that you can access there. If not, some of the municipalities are able to provide support in kind, like reducing building permit fees, tax abatements, those kind of things. So we do look at a partnership, not necessarily monetary, but if it can support the project in some way, we would look at that. The other one we have through our National Housing Strategy is the Innovation Fund. So this is really for truly innovative projects. utilizing new technologies, new construction methods, new financing models. So if you are looking at a project that's a little bit different, we could see if that meets our innovation criteria, and there's some funding you could access there. The funding availability on this is very broad. It's, it could be loans, it could be contributions, it could be a unique financing model. So it's worth a discussion if you're going down that route. There's also a rent to own component in there as well, we look at too. So minimum 5 units, affordability, energy efficiency, accessibility requirements as well. And then the last product is more of our commercial product. So it's not us lending to you, it's our mortgage loan insurance product, where you're getting financing from one of our approved lenders. So it could be a credit union. CMHC is underwriting that and providing the mortgage loan insurance. So it's default insurance or risk insurance essentially. But by accessing that, you can get preferred interest rates, increased amortization, reduced premiums, and it's all based on what that project looks like. So if you have affordability, energy efficiency, accessibility, we would look at what benefits we can provide through that as well. And then lastly, some of you may or may not know that in the last budget, the new co-op program was mentioned in terms of providing funding for the development of new co-op units. We do not have any information on that program at this time. As far as I know, it's currently under development. I would anticipate it would look somewhat similar to the co-investment program, but with a little bit of different structure to it. But again, if we have new information on that program, I'll make sure that Kyle and Trista are updated on that. CHF Canada would know as well. So those are essentially the funding programs that are available at this time.
Great, thank you. That's so helpful for many of the people who are reaching out to us. So the next question is, when should a co-op engage CMHC?
So we really encourage you to reach out to us when you have a little bit of a concept, so we can have a preliminary discussion on how we could potentially provide some funding, etc., and give you a little bit of direction in terms of that. And then once you've gone through a little bit more of your process in terms of some preliminary work, some planning, we'd be able to have some more meaningful conversations. And we do have kind of a list of questions that we do ask you, and that lets us guide that conversation. So how many units, where's the location, what's the status of the land, do you own the land, do you have an offer to purchase, is the land going to be leased, is the community providing the land to you, estimated loan amount, so how much is this project going to cost you. We also talk about what kind of experience you have with developing and managing affordable housing, and if you don't have that experience as a new co-op, are you engaging somebody that has that experience? So providing that direction. Do you have support from the other levels of government? So your municipality, your province. So again, that brings in that partnership aspect. And we just talk about the project in general. And when you can answer some of those questions, we're really able to provide more direction. So the further you are along in that pre-development process, the better the discussion will be. We also have a list of required documentation, and that kind of goes into, I know what Trista's next question is, so I'll kind of stop there. Talk to us when you have a concept, and then we can talk further as you're along in that pre-development stage as well.
Okay, so Christina knows the next question, but then it is, what stage should people have completed before working with CMHC?
So again, you know, kind of throughout the process, when you really start working with us in terms of doing applications for funding, and this is more along the lines of the co-investment stage, when you can answer those questions, we can provide that information. But in order to apply, the project typically needs to be pretty shovel ready. And we do have a required documentation list that outlines those items you need in order to apply. So you need to be incorporated, have your bylaws, etc. If you don't have that experience in property management and construction management, you need to provide information on who's doing that on your behalf, and what that plan looks like. Your land should be secured, so either have that land in place or have that offer in place that outlines the details of the purchase. You should have some preliminary plans. We do require some evidence of community need. So whether that's support from the municipality indicating that those units are needed, you're looking at wait lists of other housing providers, market feasibility, those kind of things. Confirmation of support from another level of government. So it could be a letter saying if this project proceeds, we'll provide these incentives, or we'll provide X number of dollars capital, or we support this project and it's needed for our community. Zoning, so your land needs to be zoned appropriately for the project in order to move forward with funding with us. Some cost estimates. Typically, we require cost estimates from your architect or engineer or a quantity surveyor. So the more further along you are in your cost estimates, so like a class B or a class A, that gives us that level of comfort that that project cost is going to be relatively accurate. So you're not having cost overruns, and then it's where's this money coming from? We do look at financial statements. Understandable, if it's a new co-op, we'll accept alternatives to that. And then our financial viability worksheet. So this really outlines a number of pieces. So your project costs, where's your funding coming from, as well as what are your housing charges. So what money do you have coming in, and what are your operating expenses? So to make sure that the project's financially viable and able to sustain any debt you may have to take out on that. So that's something we work with you through the process. Like when we have some of those discussions, we will lead you down to here's the viability worksheet, work through it. And a lot of this pre-development activity and the evidence of community need, business plans, marketing, market feasibility, financial viability. Like Dan said, having a consultant is a good route, because a lot of times they have been down the road with us with CMHC and have that knowledge and able to provide some direction for you. So that is something to consider as well. Once you're going down the project road, to have that consultant to work with you and on your behalf.
Thank you so much, Christina. It's been so informative. So I'm gonna start opening it up. We have the questions that we've been receiving throughout this entire presentation. So if the panelists would like to yeah, stick around and we can, and if you have an answer, please jump in. So I will just start with the first question that came in was regarding the Piney project. Is it a multi-stakeholder co-op? If so, is the RM a member of the co-op? And can rural municipalities be members?
Very good question. Yeah, technically the Piney Prod group is registered as a community service co-op, which is a nonprofit type of co-op. But they do have different types of members under the one umbrella. So individuals can be members, businesses can be members, government organizations could technically be members. And specifically for the RM, they've provided a lot of support with people power, but they're also going to provide support with some of the funding. They're making a contribution to the project costs.
Thanks, Kyle. So the next question is for community service co-ops that are focused on seniors housing, are some providing services as a part of that beyond housing? For example, programming, health services, or food services?
Yeah, good question. All of the nonprofit structured seniors focused co-ops I'm aware of do provide some additional services like shared meals, like communal living spaces, and some actually go as far as providing on-staff health services and nursing support. In those cases, of course, the operational costs can be a bit higher. There are also lots of nonprofit housing co-ops that are tenant owned that are exclusively or structured for seniors as well. So you've got kind of both the newly retired seniors housing co-ops and the ones that provide more longer term care.
Okay, so the next question I am going to ask is somebody was curious to see if James could elaborate on what member run, but not really member owned means. James, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I can answer that. Okay, the housing cooperative is owned by the business, Rainbow Housing Cooperative Limited. Okay, we don't own any of our units or the property. The business owns that, and we run the business. We elect our board members. Our board members do and then the members approve the budget annually, housing charge increases. They approve the auditor. They approve the audited financial statements on an annual basis, of board elections, and with the committees. But that's the difference. We don't own the units. We don't own the property, but we run the business. That's the biggest difference.
Okay, so the last question, thank you very much, James, but the
You're
last
welcome.
question, like we are running short on time and there's been some amazing questions coming in throughout this conversation, is from Harold asking if co-ops can be done on reserves. That one, I'm not aware of any. Kyle?
I'm not aware of any housing co-ops that operate on First Nations reserve land. Not to say it can't be done, but I'm not aware of any yet. If you're interested in starting one, we would definitely love to be a part of that project.
Yes. So, James would like to speak.
You may want to check out the, I do believe there are some urban reserves in Ontario that do have housing co-ops on their urban reserve. You may want to check there.
Thank you so much, James. Okay, I will. Yeah, like I had mentioned before, we are going to be wrapping it up. There are many, many questions that we would love to answer. And we just are running short on time here. So we will be taking these questions and answering them directly. And then also for people who are new to cooperatives first, or you may know this already, is these ideas for the webinars and the structures for the webinars come directly from you. Whenever there is questions or interest in a particular topic, we will do follow-up webinars, information sessions, and that's where we get this in, like the idea for this. So there was a big interest in housing co-ops. That's how we came up with this topic here today. So we will be compiling all of the questions that we've been getting through social media, through this webinar, and we will be looking for follow-up. So if there is a topic or something that we have not covered here today, we may do an additional session. So please send us your emails. You can reach any of us for Kyle, if you it's Kyle@cooperativesfirst.com, Trista@cooperativesfirst.com, and Riley@cooperativesfirst.com. So feel free to reach out to us, sign up for our newsletters. We have the Your Way Together newsletter, we have the Cooperatives First newsletter, and we have a 3 good ideas newsletter as well. So I want to thank you for attending here today. Does anybody have any last words before we close it out?
I'll maybe just say we've seen some questions in the chat. We'll share some of the links that we've posted in the chat in addition to the recording, so y'all can get that information in the next few days.
James?
Yes, I like to use a word called imagine. Imagine what we've accomplished here today. Now, if we put all of our heads together and come up with and start building housing co-ops, can you imagine the response that's going to be in 20, 30, 40 years from now?
Thank you so much, James, for speaking to it, and I know you have such a wealth of information and experience within housing co-ops. Thank you, Christina and Dan, for sharing the information for people who are just coming here and learning about housing co-ops. So once again, I want you to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for being here. Until next time, Westes.